I'm Bill Glass. I'm going to give you a program tonight on something dear to my heart, and that is the protection and managing and restoring prairies. And I've kind of titled this, How a Bird Saved the Prairie. That saved a prairie. Now, maybe not this exact same bird, but birds like it. But when I think about it, actually this bird had a more significant part than other birds because it made the newspapers, its picture made the newspapers and in some magazines. So this is the upland sandpiper. And this is an endangered bird in the state of Illinois. And it's important to this story that I'm going to tell you. It's a rare bird, and when birds are rare, people get interested in them and want to protect them. So we're going to take a look at the story here about how this bird helped protect the prairie. But first, I think you need to know a little bit about upland sandpipers. They're shorebirds. They're in that group of birds that are called shorebirds, so called because they tend to feed along wetlands, the shoreline of wetlands. They feed on insects and things along there. But upland sandpipers and a few of the other birds don't do that. They feed in the upland areas in prairies, and maybe that's how it's got its name, upland sandpiper. So upland sandpipers are a migratory grassland bird. They spend their summers in North America, and that's kind of the purple area. They spend winters, our winters anyway, down in South America, primarily Argentina and Uruguay, and then the kind of yellow areas where you might see them during migration. And the early migrants, they're here usually by mid-April, and then they're heading south again by mid-July. Pretty soon, they'll be heading south back to Argentina or wherever they're going to go. All right, so upland sandpipers are grassland birds. They like large open areas. They're area sensitive. That is, if an area is too small, they won't nest in it. They also like areas that are relatively tree and shrub free. And they also like short grass areas, or actually a mix of maybe short and medium height grasses. So they're kind of a particular bird. They've got certain likes and dislikes, and if you don't meet those likes, they won't nest there. They do nest kind of in loose colonies at times, and this field you see here would be a good place for upland sandpipers. There's a few trees, but they're out in the middle somewhere. They're not really all over the place. But sometimes they'll nest in loose groups. You might have 4 or 5 pairs nesting in an area like this, but they're not like a colonial bird like herons that would nest all in one tree or something like that. This is a young upland sandpiper. They're precocial. That is, the young are feathered and ready to walk soon after hatching. Precocial birds usually hatch all about the same time, and then they take off and leave the nest with their parents. The adults take the parents out to areas to feed. The nest is usually in that medium height grasses, and then the adults take the young off to feed into the short grasses. And the adults do not feed the young. The young are on their own to feed themselves. They're not like the robins in your backyard where the adults have to feed them. They're pretty well camouflaged, and the adults will protect them, kind of like if you've seen killdeers, how they act when a predator is around, or if you're around. They'll make a lot of noise and try to get the predator to leave the young alone. So where might you find upland sandpipers? Well, we mentioned they like big grassy areas, has to be a large size, no trees, certain heights. Grazed areas are good because the cattle provide that grass height that they need. Some other areas that they frequently can be found at are areas that are mowed frequently. They've been seen at airports and sod farms. So this story, this is the discovery part of this story. We're going to kind of cover this in 3 parts. The discovery phase, which we're going to talk about now, and we'll talk about a conservation phase, protection phase, and then a restoration phase. But this is about discovering this area. And the story starts about 1982 when the late Carl Becker, who was working for the Illinois Endangered Species Protection Board, had a meeting at the Joliet Army Ammunition Plant. And the Joliet Army Ammunition Plant is located just south of the town of Joliet, which is 40 miles southwest of Chicago. And he went there for a meeting, and he saw upland sandpipers there. He saw something like this. And he also heard them. And they like to stand up on, in the spring, they like to stand up high and announce their presence. And I'm going to try to play the call here. We'll see if I'm successful. So people liken it to a wolf whistle. I won't say anymore. But anyway, that's what Carl probably heard and saw. I'm going to turn this. And he realized that they don't want to stop. He realized, what the heck is going on here? Hang on. Yeah. So he realized that there were probably a lot of upland sandpipers out there because they had a lot of grazing land that was land that was being grazed by cattle. Anyway, so the arsenal, or I'm going to interchange the word arsenal with Joliet Ammunition Plant all the time, just so it's the same thing. But it was a restricted area, big chain link fence, there were guards, and nobody really knew what was in there other than the people that worked there. But with a little bit of luck, the Illinois Department of Natural Resources was able to, in 1983, get a biologist in there to take a look at a couple of areas to see if there were upland sandpipers there. And he did see some. The next year, I was hired by the Department of Natural Resources, and I helped, and we got into a few more areas, and we realized that there might be quite a few upland sandpipers. Then I took over those surveys. They've been going on for 40 years, but we soon discovered that there were a lot of upland sandpipers there. And that we're going to see, it leads to helping protect this land. But while we did those surveys, we also came across this bird, which is the migrant loggerhead shrike. This bird's threatened in the state of Illinois. So now we had two birds out there. And thought, well, this might be an important place. Loggerhead shrikes, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about them, and we're going to diverge a little bit and talk about them because they're kind of a neat bird. They're a raptor wannabe. They don't have big talons like a hawk or an eagle has or an owl, yet they feed on other birds, other animals, mice, snakes, whatever. And the way they do that is they've got a hooked beak, they grab the animal by their beak, and then they've got to impale that animal on a sharp stick or a thorn or a barbed wire fence works, and then they can sit there and eat it.
How big are they? Are they big?
They're about the size of a robin. So this is the type of habitat they like. They like short grasses also, but they like some wood, some shrubby area, especially thorny shrubs, so they can impale their prey on it. So there were areas like this at the arsenal. This would not be good for upland sandpipers because it's a little bit too woody. So many times we'd find nests by finding impaled prey on trees. So here's a snake and a crayfish. And in the spring, the males are trying to impress females that I'm a good provider. Sometimes you'll find, 5 different snakes on a barbed wire fence or something like that. And they usually nest in these thorny trees. They got their thorns right there, so they've got their little refrigerator right there with them. So anyway, I'm going to give you a little more information on these guys because they're really kind of a neat bird. This is what they look like close up. And once word got out that there was a large population of these, we got a graduate student contacted us and wanted to study them. She was studying loggerhead shrikes. And we thought, well, that'd be great because we want to know more about them. So Amy Shabbat was that graduate student, and she was very good at finding the nests, much better than we were. And a lot of times they'll nest several times, and the second nest is really hard to find, but she was really good at it. So it was a good relationship. She was getting data from her master's thesis, So I'm just going to go over a little bit what she did. So she would trap them. She had these traps, you can see them in the photograph, and she has them baited with her pet mice. The mice are in a little cage, the bird can't get them, but the bird goes into the trap, sets it off, and the lid comes down, and then she takes them out and measures them and does all kinds of other stuff. The interesting thing was, if she caught a female, she would never catch that female again, or very seldom. She could catch the males over and over again. So I don't know what that means, but it might be smartness, intelligence, or it might just be the males were really interested in trying to get as much food to provide the female as possible. But you could take that either way you want to go. So then she would take measurements at them. She also would take a feather off because she was trying to do some chemical analysis with them. But she had these, she would put these little, they were the cardboard part of a toilet paper roll, put them in there so they'd be calm. But the thing that we were really interested in, she would band them. And she would put a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service band, which is the silver one, and that would identify that particular bird, when it was banded, where it was banded, who banded it, and everything for its life. And if someone found that band, they'd send it to the Fish and Wildlife Service, and that information would go back to her. She put on colored bands so that she could trap of the birds, each nest's birds, from year to year, and then she also banded the young. So I'll just tell you a few things that she found out. We had been noticing that a lot of times the loggerhead shrikes were using the same tree year after year, sometimes the same nest, the little refurbishing from year to year. We assumed, well, it's the same birds. Well, she found out, because of the colored bands, that it wasn't. It was seldom the same birds. And it was just that was a good spot. It was a good territory, and maybe it was a good tree. It had just the right structure to build a nest in. So that was kind of interesting. She also found out that they were having a hard time raising young or getting young to leave the nest. The nests were getting predated, either by raccoons, other birds, or snakes or something. We don't even know what all was attacking the nest. And they would re-nest sometimes 3 times to get young off for that year. And there was a lot of recruitment, birds coming in from outside of the arsenal to replace those birds, which we didn't know about either. So those were just a few of the things she found. It was a really good working relationship. But we discovered that there were a lot of grassland birds out there at the arsenal. Grassland birds are the group of birds that are declining the fastest in North America. They're in the most trouble. And we found out that there were a lot of grassland birds out here. I've just showed you a few there. The bobolink likes medium height grasses. We had the upland sandpiper likes it shortish. The harrier kind of doesn't really care. It's a ground nesting raptor. We had it nesting out there. Henslow sparrows were kind of rare at the arsenal. We had a few, but they became very common later. They like taller grasses. But it became very obvious that the Joliet Army Ammunition Plant was very important for grassland birds in general, not just upland sandpipers, and maybe for Illinois and maybe the whole Midwest. About this time, this was about 1991, the Army declared some of the site a Superfund site where they had manufactured TNT. And then in 1992, or I think it was 92, they were required to do surveys for federally listed species, federally listed plants and animals. So they turned to us, the Department of Natural Resources, because by that time we had a pretty good working relationship with them. They let us come and do our thing, and they trusted us that we weren't going to be terrorists. So what we did was we hired experts to do these surveys, but we were just going in there 3 days the whole year. But these people went in for the whole summer, sometimes into the winter. So looked at the plants, looked at the birds, looked at the insects, looked at the mammals, primarily bats, looked at clams, fish, amphibians, reptiles, and so forth. With that, we found, there's all kinds of stuff out there we didn't know about. So here's just two things. The king rail is threatened in the state. It's a wetland bird. We didn't know they were out there, but if there's someone out there all summer, they find this out. So that was more information. Long-eared owls, we found out, would overwinter at the Joliet Army Ammunition Plant. You might have 30 or 40 of them out there. And we also found out that there were some state-listed plants. So there weren't any federally listed species, but there were all these state-listed species, and I just gave you a few. So this was like, wow, this place, has a lot to offer out there. Let me tell you a little bit about the arsenal, and then we'll talk about what happened. So we're going to go back in time a little bit. The Joliet Army Ammunition Plant was the first arsenal built for World War II. And they started buying up the land in the late 1930s. Probably early 1939, maybe 1938, something like that. And the reason they chose Joliet is that there was a good water source. You had the Kankakee River, the Des Plaines River, the DuPage River. You had a large source of workers. You had the city of Chicago there with a lot of people. And it was in the middle of the country, so they thought it was safe from attack. So it was the first one built, and by 1939, it was going. And originally it was about 40,000 acres. And it was really two plants. It was divided, and I'll show you a picture in a little bit. It was divided by Route 53, or the old Route US 66. The west side manufactured TNT. The east side put it into shells, munitions, whatever. So this is the manufacturing area here. The west side of the arsenal was here. This is 53, and then this is the east side, and these were the areas where they made the munitions. You'll notice there's a lot of rail lines. There's a lot of, you're going to see a lot of buildings, a lot of roads. It was an active plant. It was a chemical plant. You can see that here. They had a lot of storage facilities. There were concrete bunkers to store the TNT. These are warehouses over here. Anyway, I think it was about 1993. It was right after the surveys. The Army approached George Sangmeister, who was a local U.S. representative. They decided they were going to close the plant. They didn't need it. TNT is no longer used. They have more explosive stuff they use. And so they decided they're going to close it. And this was before there were wholesale plant closures and stuff with the Army. So they wanted him to decide, come up with, what do we do with this? So Sangmeister got a committee together of 24 interested people. And if you can imagine, at the time of closure, there's 24,000 acres, 40 miles from Chicago. You can imagine everybody wants it. Sangmeister got together a committee of 24 people. There were other politicians on it. There were developers. There were conservationists. There was a wide range of people. And he wanted a unanimous decision. And he got it, but I know he had to twist a lot of arms because everybody wanted that land, and they didn't want to share it. So anyway, this is the plan that they came up with. The town of Elwood right here wanted an industrial park. They got this blue area. That's the manufacturing area. That would become their industrial park. The town of Wilmington down here wanted an industrial park. They got this blue area. Sangmeister wanted a veterans cemetery. He got his veterans. So this is Abraham Lincoln National Veterans Cemetery. And then the county wanted a landfill. Will County, that's the landfill here. The rest of this land was to be transferred to the Forest Service for the first national tallgrass prairie in the country, and that was to become Mediawin National Tallgrass Prairie. And I'm going to stop here just to tell you that Mediawin is a Potawatomi word. It means healing society. It has something to do with their healing society. So it was thought appropriate because you got this land that's been disturbed for manufacturing TNT, and we're going to be healing it. So that's where it kind of came from. So he brought this. The first time it went to Congress, it failed. And it failed because of the landfill. There are some senators that said, hey, we should not be giving land away for landfills. And that kind of makes sense. But next year, Sangmeister retired, and then Jerry Weller took his place. Weller brought it back, and it was pointed out to those senators, but the county is going to have to accept waste from the government for free to go into that landfill. So there was going to be a lot of stuff torn down at the arsenal. Things that couldn't be recycled had to go into the landfill, and it was going to go in there for free. So then it passed. So anyway, this is what was going to go to the Forest Service, basically about 20,000 acres, and it was to be restored to tallgrass prairie. And I don't know whether you can see this, I'll read it off. There was a really unique legislation. Congress, it was the Illinois Conservation Act of 1995. Congress told the Forest Service, these are the purposes of this, going to be for this place. And they were to conserve and enhance the native populations of habitats of fish, wildlife, and plants, to provide opportunities for scientific, environmental, land use, education, and research, to allow for the continuation of agricultural uses. And that was important to us because it turns out that those grassland birds were primarily using the grazed areas. And we wanted to be able to maintain them until we could figure out how to get them to use the restored areas. So that was important. And then the final one was it was also to be used a purpose for recreational opportunities as long as it wasn't inconsistent with the previous ones. So recreation they wanted to have recreation, but it's not the most important goal there. The most important goal is to protect the land and to restore the prairie. While all this is going on, and before the land is even transferred, and there's a lot of interest, and a lot of environmental groups in the Chicago area got really interested in this and started funding studies out there before the land was transferred, because everybody wanted this to happen. So some funders funded a survey to see what are the kind of areas that are dominated by native vegetation, because most of it was disturbed. So this map shows that. It also shows some stuff outside, but if you just consider what's inside that dark line. Those were the areas of native vegetation where native vegetation was kind of dominant. Another study looked at the streams. There was a study that looked at view sheds. People wanted to be able to go out there into the tallgrass prairie and see it and see nothing but tallgrass prairie like you would have maybe 400 years ago. So there was a study to do that. So there are all these studies. There was a lot of interest in this, and this was really driven by various groups and volunteers and the public. So the native remnants, I just thought I'd show you those. There was Dolomite Prairie, which is a specialized prairie. I've got a picture down here at the bottom where the soil is real thin over Dolomite bedrock. It's a very rare form of prairie. Then there was some black soil prairie or tallgrass prairie, sedge meadow, marsh, seeps, savanna, some woodlands and streams. There's not a lot, and most of that's disturbed. It's not pristine. The reason people were so interested in this land and restoring it is that Illinois, the prairie state, you can see what the extent of what prairie was in Illinois. That's the green. You can see most of the state was prairie. What's left today? Less than 1/100 of 1%, just a few thousand acres and of really undisturbed prairie, and even that, a lot of that's disturbed. So there's very little left. And people wanted a large prairie restoration, and they were talking, well, this could be the Yellowstone of the Midwest. You know, people could come here from all over. Bison were mentioned, all kinds of things. So Forest Service had to do a plan. So it took a while, but they did an environmental impact statement and a plan. And I'm just going to go over a little bit of the plan stuff. This is the desired future condition, at least for the short term. The kind of caramel colored areas here would be restored to prairie. The blue areas are wetlands, restored to wetlands. A lot of that was probably wet prairie. The green areas are woodlands or forests, and then there's savanna, the brown. This yellow area was kind of set aside for grassland habitat, it was called, and that's that grassland bird habitat. We wanted to maintain those grassland birds, eventually get them using the native prairie. And we'll come back a little bit to that. They identified a trail system. There were equestrian trails, biking trails, hiking trails. There was even suggested a tram route so that people that couldn't get out there and walk in the prairie could take the tram and see it. And then there were also goals. And I'll just give you some of the habitat restoration goals that were identified. They were to protect and restore and link those existing remnants that we saw, those little green areas, manage for native wildlife with emphasis on grassland birds, reconstruct high-quality native habitats through conversion of old fields, croplands, and the abandoned land, protect and enlarge the Dolomite Prairie, and then the last one was just generally to protect the native plants and animals. And then there were some goals for the grassland bird habitat, because again, grassland birds were pretty important, and they were really the drivers that kind of protected this land. If it hadn't been for the upland sandpiper and then finding out all these other grassland birds, I don't think there would be a Medewa National Tallgrass Prairie. There might have been some land protected there. It might be a couple hundred acres, whatever, but it was really those birds. So it's important to maintain a minimum of 2,000 acres of prime habitat for grassland birds in a year. Cool season grasses may be used when necessary for managing grassland birds. This is where you're using non-native grazing grasses, but again, we want to try to use native plants in the future. Allow for the continued use of cattle grazing for managing that grassland bird habitat. Grassland birds, there's 3 different suites. Some like it short, upland sandpiper. Some like it medium, the bobolink. And some like it tall, the Henslow sparrow. You've seen those 3 species. So you've got to have these differences in grass height, and grazing provides that medium to the short one. And then to restore and maintain at least 10,000 acres of unfragmented grasslands in 5 different units. And then the bottom one you can't see, which was very important, was to allow for the possibility of use of bison as a grazer on an experimental basis. And that's going to become very important. So the plan identified these are those large unfragmented areas for grassland birds for the future. So there were a lot of different desired future conditions and goals identified in the plan. I've just given you a few. So we went through, first of all, the discovery phase. That was the upland sandpipers. This was the protection phase or conservation phase. Now we're going to switch over to the restoration phase. So this is the canvas we have to work on. This is an aerial photograph outlining the current boundaries of Medewa National Tallgrass Prairie. Now I'm going to add that there still is some land in here. There's some donut holes in here that the Army hasn't transferred yet. But this ultimately will be the shape of what it is. So this is our canvas. This is what we have to work with. And I want to point out that there's still a lot of buildings. There's a lot of roads. There's rail lines. There's a lot of things to be done out here. So some of those buildings, they're all dilapidated, old. Some of the buildings were made of transite or covered in transite. And transite's a mix of concrete and asbestos, which is bad. And so it's very expensive to get rid of it. But, once you do, you can get it to that landfill and then it's buried there. We have telephone poles and power lines and so forth to deal with. And then there's there were 380 some of these concrete bunkers that they stored munitions and TNT in. So this was going to be a different type of a restoration project. If you look at restoration projects around here, they're usually in the tens or hundreds of acres. There's a couple of large ones in the Midwest. There's the Nature Conservancies and the Chusa Grassland. There's, in Indiana, they have the Kankakee Sands. But this was even going to be, 4 or 5 times larger than those. And then we had to deal with all this infrastructure. So it was going to be quite a job. We knew we were going to learn from these other restorations, and we knew that we were going to have to try new things, and we knew we'd make mistakes, and we knew we'd have to change. So there was going to be a lot of adaptive management going on. We had to come up with new techniques or new ways of doing things. Sometimes they didn't work. You try something else. But we had a lot to deal with that other restorations don't have to deal with. So what I'm going to do is just go over the first restoration we did. It's just called the South Patrol Road restoration. This is it here. We did the addition later. This is an infrared aerial photograph. The red indicates vegetation that is active, that's photosynthesizing. The gray means there's no vegetation there. So those are crop fields. Notice that there was a rail line. We were going to have to get rid of that. There's an old county road that goes down here. You'll see we decided to leave that. But then there was this huge drainage ditch that went through here. Then there's all these tree lines and so forth. But this is what we were starting with. So I'm going to give you some of the things we looked at. I'm not going to give you everything, but you can go back and you can look at the government land survey records. In Will County, the land was surveyed in the 1830s, before there was hardly anybody there. The surveyors were surveying the land so that homesteaders could get it, and there would be markers, or people could buy it or whatever, and you knew what you were buying. And they were basically marking off square miles, and then 36 square miles made a township. And they would walk those lines, and they would record. If they were in woods, they would record that. They would enter into prairie, they would record that and where that was and so forth. And I'm not going to read these, but I think you can, some of them say, entered prairie or something like that. They would then take that and they would make a plat map out of it. And the map would show the vegetation that was there. Now, they didn't go into a lot of detail. So prairie just meant that it was open. It could be a sedge meadow, it might even be a marsh or a prairie. As long as they could walk through it, it was probably prairie. If it was forested, it was a woodland. If it was a really deep water, they might call a slough or something like that. Okay, but we do have these maps, and they're at the state library. And the project area we're going to be talking about is right here. And then later on, people have taken that information and other information and come up with land cover for various counties in the state in the early 1800s. And this is Will counties. And again, we're going to be restoring an area down in here. And then I've just got a close-up. You can see that project area was in prairie. There was forested area along the Kankakee River. This is Prairie Creek, which flows through Medewan. You'll notice that they don't always continue the stream on because they didn't walk that portion of it. They probably walked, this was probably one of the section lines or something. So some of this is a bit of an estimate. But you'll notice that it was all prairie where we're going to be working. But again, it could have been wet prairie. It could have been sedge meadow. It might have been some marsh out there, and I'm sure it was. So then you can also look at the 1939 aerial photographs. You'll notice the Army had already started building. They had this rail line in over here. They had some of the bunkers in. They had some other parking lots down here. But the project area, you'll notice, again, it's primarily in crops, but the colors of the soil and the texture that you see on the map can kind of tell you some things. This is a little dry ridge. This is really flat out here, but there's a dry ridge. This is it. And you get up there, you realize, oh, I'm about 10 feet above the rest of it. These dark areas might have been some sort of seasonal wetlands. So you start picking up a little more information, then look at the soils maps, and the soil maps will tell you what those soils developed under. So prairie soils versus wetland soils versus savanna soils or woodland soils or whatever. So you start putting that together. This is the existing condition kind of map. What was out there? These are tree lines. There are some wetlands that were identified. There's that rail line, and there's a wetland there. So this is kind of the existing condition, and this was the bottom diagram is kind of the first go at what are our proposed conditions. What do we want this to look like? You see most of it's wetland, and again, like I said, a lot of that's probably wet prairie. The areas that say prairie are probably mesic to dry prairie. Then you can take that and refine that a little more. So this is a refinement based on the soils, based on topography, based on just maybe a little guessing of what's going to happen where. So there's some wetland areas, the blue, some dry kind of prairie areas, the red, and then there's just some other, wet prairie type areas. We also decided early on that we were going to keep this diagonal road and make it a trail that would come down here. And so we decided that we wanted some areas that we would really plant heavily and put a lot of plant plugs in because we wanted them to look really nice right along the trail. A lot of times when a forest preserve puts a trail through a prairie, they don't go through the good prairie. They go around the edges. You don't want to do that. Well, we have a blank slate here, so we're going to plant it really heavy right along the edges of that. And then the same thing here, this was a wetland. We thought we'd put a lot of wetland plants in there so people could walk up there and see it. And this was kind of a showcase area in through here, so we were going to put a lot of plants in there. We were going to seed the whole thing and put plugs in other spots, but most of the plant plugs were going to go into those three areas. So this is a photograph from a helicopter looking at the site prior to any work being done. This is that dry ridge. These are these tree lines. This is this drainage ditch which was 8 to 12 feet deep. There's a grain elevator here off the site, and kind of remember that because I'm going to show you a picture when we get done too. So, first thing we have to worry about is we want to return the hydrology to what it was. And most of the crop fields in the Midwest are too wet at times. At least portions of crop fields are too wet in the spring and too wet in the fall for farmers to be out in. So what do? They put in tiles. They put in field tiles to drain the land so they can get in to do their planting and do their harvesting. Originally what were put in were clay tiles. You can see a whole bunch of them here down through here. Now it's primarily plastic tiles that are put in. But we knew there was going to be a lot of tiles out there because this had a lot of wet soils. So how do you go about finding them? We got to disable them, we have to find them. Sometimes there's records. We didn't have any records from the Army. Our hydrologists at the time wanted to come up with the least costly method. So he tried a lot of things. He tried ground penetrating radar. And it's just this device you kind of go over the ground. The problem was it tends to work, but for some reason, some soils work better than others, and we had some soils where the ground penetrating radar was not working real well. We knew where there were some tiles because we had found the outlets. They couldn't locate with the ground penetrating radar. The Roto-Rooter guy said, I can find them. He couldn't find them either. You can take a probe, a metal bar, and kind of look for them, but that's kind of hard. What they ended up doing was kind of doing some exploratory trenches and finding them that way. We finally decided, not in this project, but later, again, we learned some of these things with adaptive management. We decided, you know what, it may not be the cheapest method, but the most cost-effective method was to go out and hire someone who puts in field tiles and tell them, we want a map of what's out here. They kind of have a good idea where to go, where they would put in the tiles, and then they just dig a little trench and check, and then they can follow that. And that turned out to be the best method. So anyway, so for this project, they did some exploratory trenches. They found some field tiles. We estimated there were 30,000 feet, that's 5.5 miles of field tiles out here. And we know we didn't get them all because there were a few that started working again later, and we had to do something about that. But for this project, again, we were trying to keep the cost down. We were experimenting. Instead of taking them all out, they just broke up sections. Later, we just decided, you know what, it's just best to take them all out. Once you find them, just go down the line. That way, when you're doing that, you find the laterals going off. If you don't do that, you don't find all the laterals. Sometimes they start working, and then you have problems. But soon after we disabled them, you'll see what happened on the right. That was dry, and now it's wet. And that didn't take long. That was probably 3 months or so after we disabled the field tiles. It was, once you get the fall rains, and it takes several years really for the hydrology to return to some normalcy. But so now we've got a lot of wetlands. So now we went back out, and these are the wetlands we mapped based upon what came back. And I'm going to show you that our little estimate here wasn't that accurate. You notice all this blue here, that's over in here. This big blue blob here, it's over in here. So, we made our best estimates, but now we had a better idea. So this was going to drive our planting more than this other map did. So we had to remove those tree lines. Again, we were trying to do this inexpensively. So the inexpensive way to do it was to have a bulldozer go in the winter, dig up the trees, push them out, pile them up, and then we burn the piles. Well, soon learned that wasn't a good idea. I mean, it worked, but the trouble was you had a lot of soil on the roots. And then once you burned everything, then you had this pile of soil. We were able to get rid of some of them, but some of them ended up in the middle of a wetland. They're still there. I mean, they're not huge or anything, but they were a problem. And then I just never liked that because you end up sterilizing the soil when you burn like that. And a lot of weeds come in for a few years. It takes a while to recover. This was that drainage, on the right is that drainage ditch. We filled that in. It was 8 to 12 feet deep. That was filled in with the field tile disabling, and that's why the water came back. Then when it was time to plant, we had 3 different plant mixes. We had kind of a dry mesic mix of prairie. That was going to go on that ridge and other kind of dry areas. We had a wet mix, and the wet mix, we kind of just decided that we would just throw in the marsh vegetation, the sedge meadow vegetation, and the wet prairie vegetation. We were not going to try to figure out where they were going to be out there, and we were just going to let nature run its course and hope that the plants sort themselves out. And I think, so there was a dry mix and a medium mix and then that wet mix. The best time to put the seed out is in dormant season during the winter. So this is an agricultural fertilizer spreader. It's an airflow, and we hired them to put the seed out. So that big machine's out. We're on a big scale here. We're doing, almost 500 acres. And we want it done in a day or two. We don't want to be out there messing around forever. So it was done in the winter on the snow. It's a good time to put it out. You can see if the seed's coming out. You can see where you've been. If you look on the right, you can see the seed. I get asked the question, well, aren't you concerned that the birds are going to see the seed and come and eat all the seed on the top of the snow? What happens is the sun comes out, the seed is darker than the snow, it just melts its way down to the soil, and it's ready to germinate in the spring. And then when you have the freezing and thawing in the spring, it gets buried to just the right distance. So it worked really well. We were also going to put in a lot of plugs. There are some plants you can't get seed for, or they're difficult to get seed. They're hard to grow. So we decided that we're going to put a lot of plugs in too, especially plants that were, maybe you couldn't find too many of them. You could find only maybe a pound of seed, but you could buy, several thousand plants or something like that. So there were a lot of plugs put in, and a lot of this work, in fact, most of that work was done by volunteers. Through the years, we've used a lot of different methods for planting. Usually we like to broadcast seed in the winter. For small areas, it could be just hand broadcasting, or maybe with a UTV or something, or a tractor with a broadcast spreader that's going to spread that seed out. We have done some drilling. A drill goes through and it kind of cuts a little furrow and it drops the seed down, then it closes it up. It works, but the problem is then you have plants in a row, and that doesn't look very natural. But we have used that in times, usually in areas that were already had some native vegetation in that we didn't want to disc up or anything. So we wanted to put more in there, so we would use it for that. So a lot of seed went into this, and I'll give you those details here in a minute. I'll give it to you now. So 460 acres. We seeded it with 54 grass species, 121 forb or broadly flowering plant species. There were about 30 plus additional species put in. And this is where it gets a little funny. The tall grasses were left out of the mix. We didn't put any little big blue stem, Indian grass, and switchgrass. Yet those are the grasses that the tall grass prairie is named after. Why would you do that? Well, the reason is, if you put them in, they tend to be aggressive and they will take over. And believe me, I've done some restorations when I worked for the state that are that way because we didn't have a lot of seed. And once those grasses get established, it's hard to get anything else in there. So our idea was to put everything else in first. The short stature grasses, all the forbs, give them 2 or 3 years, and then, say 3 years from now, go in the winter and overseed with the tall grasses. Now, it turned out there was some contamination in some of the seed, and we did get quite a bit of Indian grass in a couple areas, but it did work fairly well. I think that we probably should have put a little bit more in, and we started doing that because there are some areas that just don't have those grasses right now, and I think they ought to have some. So 7,400 pounds of seed were put in over a 12-year period. Most of that, probably 75% of that, were put in that first winter. Plant plugs, they were installing them yearly for about 12 years, and 250,000 were put in. Again, probably about 3/4 of that was done the first couple of years. There were 12 different agencies that helped us on this, and it's really important. I'm going to stop here. This is the way things get done at Medewan is through partners. And there were 12 different partners that helped in this project. And they helped fund it. They helped do the work. You can't see this here, but the initial cost was a little over $1 million. And 90% of that came from partners. It didn't come from the federal government. It didn't come from Medewan. It came from partners. And that's the way most of the restorations have taken place at Medewan. The Forest Service, and why would people do that? Well, they want to help on this project, and then the Forest Service, they're expecting the Forest Service to commit to managing that land for perpetuity, okay? But without partners, I'll stand up here and say there'll probably be like 400 acres maybe restored out there. There's over 3,000 in the process, okay? Okay, so this is that before picture. Notice again, this is that grain elevator. This is the after picture. The grain elevator's down here. This is all prairie of some sort, wet prairie, sedge meadow type. And this area, the addition has been restored to. These trees are gone now. This was the first restoration project. And the reason people wanted to restore this one first was that it had all those hydric soils. One of our partners, the Wetlands Initiative, wanted to restore some wetlands. And they went out and got a lot of money. And we said, let's do this place because this is where we have a lot of soils that formed under wetlands, and it would be a good spot to restore those wetlands. All right, so I'm just going to show you a little progression here. I don't have a year one photo. This is up on that little ridge. But a year one photo with probably a lot of foxtail, non-native stuff. This is year two. Most of the grass you see here is Canada wild rye. It's a native prairie grass. It's not one of those big 3 dominant ones, but we put a lot of Canada wild rye in because it's very easy to germinate and it does really well, and it provided fuel for fires. So we could get in here and burn this second year. Otherwise, there may not be enough fuel to get in and burn. And Canada wild rye is not one of those real aggressive grasses. It's going to always be there, but it's going to start dropping out with time. So this is year 3. You can see there's still some Canada wild rye. This is taken a little earlier than the other photo, but you start seeing black-eyed Susans and some other plants coming up. This is year 5, about the same spot. If we looked real close, we'd probably still find some Canada wild rye, but we have a lot more diversity out there now. You've got rosinweed, compass plant, rattlesnake master, wild bergamot, obedient plant, and so forth. And then this is year 10. It's different time of the year. It's still that ridge, but you can see there's a lot more diversity now. There's pale purple coneflowers, there's prairie docks, there's white wild indigo, so forth. So there's a lot more diversity out there, and it's, every year it gets a little better. So some successes, it's doing pretty well. There are some problems. There's always invasive species you have to work with. The thing that I really thought was kind of cool, we planted Turk's cap lilies along that future trail. And I don't know, maybe we put in, maybe 60, 80 of them. There's hundreds of them out there today. They're just going crazy, which is really kind of neat. The wetlands turned out really well, and we got wetland birds like Virginia rails nesting out there. And then I had to throw in the monarch because, Medewan is like one big monarch garden. And so the South Patrol Road is one big monarch garden. There's milkweeds out there. There's all sorts of nectar plants. In the fall, in September, a lot of times you can go out there and the monarchs will be in the cottonwood trees on the edge. It'll just be thousands of them. And then they come out into the prairie and get nectar and then head south. So that's a big success. This is the ragged fringed orchid. It's not a particularly rare orchid, but orchids are kind of unique. They need a certain fungus, a mycorrhizal fungus in the soil to germinate and to grow. And we didn't plant this plant. They have tiny little seeds. This came in on its own at the South Patrol Road restoration. So those tiny little seeds, the nearest plants are a couple miles away, got there, and there still was those fungus in the soil after all those years of crops. So that was, and then there's quite a few of them out there. So that was a success that was a surprise. Some failures, and I'm going to say temporary maybe, I'm hoping. The plant on the left is the prairie violet. And my goal when I was there was to try to reintroduce the regal fritillary, which is a butterfly that's endangered in the state. Violets are its caterpillar's food plant. We planted thousands of prairie violets. And they grew for about 3 or 4 years, and now they've just kind of disappeared. And I think they're maybe a short-lived perennial. I'm not sure what's going on. I finally came to the conclusion that we stopped planting them, and I thought we need to produce seed and just keep throwing seed out every year and hope for the best. But we planted them in 3 different locations because the regal fritillary is sensitive to fire, so you want to have a couple areas that you don't burn every year. But I don't know. Hopefully in the future, maybe they'll come back or whatever will happen, or the seeds will start germinating. We also planted prairie lilies out there. We haven't seen them yet. Some of these plants take years to develop their roots before they decide to bloom. And lilies can be one of those. So I'm kind of hopeful that maybe they'll show up one of these days. All right, I'm going to get to the last part here. And that's bison have returned to Medewan. The bison pastures on the east side of Medewan, this is it, a fence was built. Had to build some infrastructure. You have to bring in the bison each fall to have a vet check them and so forth. The bulls came from Yellowstone, and that's real significant because Yellowstone Park is one of the few places where there aren't any cattle genes mixed in with the bison because people were trying to do a hybrid. years ago when there were very few bison left. The cows came from a private herd in South Dakota where the individual was trying to breed out the cattle genes. So there were about 5 bulls, and I think about 20 cows came in, and it wasn't long before the herd started growing. Bison eat differently than cattle, and we're hoping that they can provide that habitat that all these grassland birds like, and maybe we can get rid of the cattle. They also provide disturbances, like a wallow becomes a little wetland. They also have been shown to they can help in a low diversity prairie. They can kind of increase the diversity just by the way they graze. So we're hoping that the bison will allow for the upland sandpiper to be out there who likes it really short, and the dick sissel who likes it really tall. And I retired about 5 years ago, but it was starting to show that we had all of those birds out in the bison pastures. Now, whether that'll continue or what, we don't know, but it seemed like it was working. So just a few other quick little things and we'll end. We started the restorations on the west side because we wanted to link up those remnants like the plan told us to do. So this shows areas that have been restored or are in the process, and actually this should be colored in here. So these kind of lighter brown areas are areas that are being restored. So you can see that we've been linking those up. These white areas are still land that the Army has to transfer. So really, other than this area here and this area here, which was our seed production area, the west side is in pretty good shape. Now we've got, they've got to move to the other side. So just a few other things. Sandhill cranes have come back and are nesting. A couple of eagle nests. There's probably more. I don't know how many there are. Black-necked stilt started nesting out there. This is a bird from more southern that's been moving up. So anyway, most of this west side has been restored or is in the process of being restored. There's still some work to be done. And work always has to be done. It doesn't end. This is the bison pasture that has to be restored, and they're starting to do that, I think, and they're talking about restoring up here, but there's still a lot of work to be done over on the other side. So that's kind of the story of how the upland sandpiper started this process. The discovery of that bird, then the discovery of all these other birds, and then it got the land protected. And I failed to mention it, but if you remember that concept map that came out of Sangmeister's committee, most of those areas that went to the Forest Service were areas where there had been upland sandpipers or grassland birds. And I'm going to end just by saying that here's just some of the partners. What's not included here are the thousands of hours that volunteers have put in. And none of this probably could have been done to the scale that it is without these partners. And with that, I guess I can take some questions.
Yes, 2 questions. The first one, is this off of 55 in Arsenal Road?
All right, the question is, I have to repeat it for everyone on Zoom. The question is this off of 55? Yes, if you get off 55 at River Road, there's some signs. You go down, it's really off, Illinois Route 53 divides it. So that kind of that's the old 66. It parallels 55, Interstate 55. Yes.
And the second question is, where did you get most of your plugs from?
Well, where did we get most of our plant plugs from? Well, we had we grew some of them ourselves, a lot of them ourselves. We had a plant production process. We had seed beds, and we grew them. There's a greenhouse, there's shade houses. But we also purchased them, and we were very careful how we purchased. We had to know who they were. We had to know kind of where the seed was coming from. We wanted to have local genotypes, and I don't want to get into a big argument about that. People will tell you, you got to be within 25 miles, you got to be within 5 miles. We didn't get that extreme. If it's wind pollinated, you can go farther. If it's really rare, you might have to go farther, but we tried to keep it within a certain area, and the vendors that we had, assured us that the seed and the plugs were coming from that area.
Is that Thin Dog? Possibility Place in Creek 1E, is that one of them that you used?
The question was Possibility Place and Crete. They did supply some, but they don't supply the numbers that we really needed.
Right.
Yeah.
Bill, how did you plant the plugs themselves? Were you using augers or hand?
Okay, so how did we plant the plugs? Again, that was a process of learning. We got a strawberry planter. It's a pull-behind thing, and it opens a little furrow, and you drop the strawberries in. And we tried that. The trouble was you need kind of a sandier soil than we had. That didn't work real well. So we used tree planting bars. That kind of works. It doesn't work real well. We also tried a tree planting machine, which you pull behind a tractor. It's kind of like the strawberry thing. Again, it gets a furrow, it puts the plant, you put the plant in. It doesn't really close it up very well, and I don't think a lot of the plants survive. So we finally decided we're going to do it with augers. So almost everything after the first 2 years was by augers. So hand auger, you just auger, you make a hole, you put the plant, you put the dirt back in. And we were good about watering, and we would get volunteers to come out and water the plants the best we could. We kind of determined that planting for some species in the fall was a good time, a better time than the spring. They would grow some and then they'd go dormant. In the spring, they'd grow, and then if you had a drought, then you'd lose stuff, or you were out there constantly watering. So we kind of thought maybe the fall, but I'm not working there anymore. I'm not sure how that all went, but we kind of thought maybe that for some species, the fall might be the best time to plant.
How did you get the water out there?
Yeah.
How did we get the water out there? We bought some, they're actually kind of like firefighting equipment, big tanks with a gasoline engine on it and a pump, and a lot of watering cans. Anything else? Or yeah.
What kind of fish habitat do they have there?
Well, what type of fish habitat do they have there? There's 4 streams that go through there, and that's primarily it. There is a little pond that's been stocked, and they have some fishing derbies for kids. The streams, a couple of them are pretty small, and there's fish in them, but not game fish. Prairie Creek, about 4 or 5 miles meanders through. There are some areas there, there's probably some smallmouth bass. Fishing isn't allowed yet, and the concern was we don't know that much about it. Jackson Creek is a larger creek and probably the best, but only a small segment of it goes through Medewan. There is an area to the north, the Joliet Army Training Area, that was originally part of the arsenal, and that is supposed to come to the Forest Service if the Army ever decides to close it, and that has more of Jackson Creek in it. But there is no fishing, but the streams dry up a little bit. Other questions? Yes?
Beavers?
Pardon?
Are there beavers?
Are there beavers? Yes, there are beavers. And, okay, so here's the deal with, well, I don't know what they're doing anymore. Here was my deal with beavers. If they're not flooding a neighbor, I don't care. But there were some times when they were flooding neighbors, and we would have to go out and remove their dam. But if they're not flooding a neighbor, or if they're not flooding something really important, I don't care.
So they're there.
They're there. They're there, they're making dams, and they're flooding. There are wetlands that were never wetlands because of beavers. That's fine. Yeah, they're doing their job. But when they were backing up water on the neighbors, we would take the dams out. Any other questions?
How about prairie dogs?
Well, how about prairie dogs? I'm going to tell you this. There are no prairie dogs in Illinois. I didn't want to tell you that. Well, I will rephrase that. Now, there used to be some prairie dogs in Illinois, and they were on Torrance Avenue, south of Chicago, and someone had let them loose, And they were there for probably 5 or 6 years, and they're gone now. But I used to see them every so often. I'm like, what's going on? I think somebody had some pets and they released them. But prairie dogs were not in Illinois. So in the prairies, we had, in the sandy areas, you had pocket gophers. In other areas, you had Franklin's ground squirrel, 13-lined ground squirrels. Franklin's ground squirrel is about the size of a tree squirrel, but they live in burrows in the ground. They're kind of rare in the state, but they're around. So no prairie dogs, sorry. I didn't want to tell you that.
How many bison?
How many bison? And then I don't know the answer to that. We figured that the 2,000 acres could handle about 100, 120. I know they have gotten rid of some of them. They've given them to various tribes who are trying to have their own herds of bison. So, but I don't know what they were at. I think when I maybe retired, it was around 60 to 80, something like that. But you do have to get rid of them, and they've been giving them away to tribes. Somebody said something about prairie chickens.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's always talk about reintroducing prairie chickens out there. And the problem is pheasants. And pheasants will go in and parasitize prairie chicken nests. So they go in and drop their eggs into a prairie chicken nest, walk away. Their chicks hatch first. The prairie chicken goes off with somebody else's young. So that's a problem they had down in central Illinois, down there at the Prairie Chicken Ranch, whatever you call it, sanctuary. The other thing is there's a lot of predators. But anyway, at the Plains Conservation Area, there is they do raise, pheasants, thank you. They raise pheasants there. So they escape, so I don't know. The thing of it is there isn't enough habitat for them yet anyway, and they are really hard to reestablish. People have tried it, they bring them in and they disappear and that's it. So I don't know the answer, but that's something that people are really interested in, and it might happen, who knows? Yes?
So I've overheard someone say they've been out there a bunch of times and never saw the bison. I've seen the bison, but do you have any tips on how to see the bison?
No. So the question is, how do you see the bison? I go out there and I don't see the bison. So here's the problem. There are 3 pastures, and if they're in, well, there's actually 4, but one's a small one, and I don't know whether they even put them in there. There's 3 pastures, we'll say. And if they're in the one, there's a lot of trees in it. You can't see them too well if they're back by the trees. The other one, you can see about half of it, then it drops off. And if they're in the low area, you don't see them. The other pasture, if they're in there, they're probably pretty easy to see. But there's trails. If you go down the one trail and you don't see them, you got to go down the other one and you might see them there. But yeah, you don't see them every time. Unfortunately, they need to really build, I think, a sort of observation tower that you can look in. But there is a bison cam that you can go online. I know, it's not that great. It's at the corral and, yeah.
I feel like I'm playing name that tune, but I have 4 favorites: skunk, opossum, coyote, fox.
Okay, so just 4 favorites. Possums are out there, skunks are out there, coyotes are out there. I have not seen any fox, but the coyotes have probably gotten rid of the fox. There used to be fox out there. Fox have all moved into town. Yeah.
How long is the burn season with that variety of things that you have to burn there?
How much? I'm sorry.
How long is the burn season? Do you burn in the summer, in winter, or just in spring?
Well, the burn season ought to extend from October through beginning of April. But in reality, it's usually in the spring. The best time to burn especially the wetlands, is in the fall, because you can get a fire through them. If you burn them in the spring, you don't get a fire through them, and then willows start coming in. But I don't want to get into it, but it's difficult sometimes to burn certain seasons out there because the burning is done by the hotshot crew. They fight fires out west, and they bring those people on. A lot of those people are 9-month jobs. They bring them on in the spring, and by fall, they're gone. So you don't have enough people to burn. So that's a little bit of a problem. So it all depends if they can bring people in from somewhere else.
And with all that wetland, do you have a cattail problem in there at all?
A cattail problem? Oh, yeah. So the question is there a cattail problem? So there are now 3 cattails. There's a native cattail, there's one that's introduced, and then there's the hybrid. And the hybrid is basically taken over. So when I was there, we were constantly fighting the hybrid. The other problem they have in the wetlands is Phragmites, common reed. That's another problem.
On that scale, how do they fight the cattail?
Herbicides, something use.
But those are problems. And there's a lot of other problems. So, you know, a lot of that land was grazing land, and they planted things out there, especially legumes. Clovers aren't too bad, but bird's foot trefoil. And legumes, seeds can sit in the ground in the seed bank for years. So even if we would put some areas in crops for a couple of years, get rid of most of the weeds that way, but you got all these seeds in there and they keep coming. So some of those things are going to be problems for a long, long time.
Yes. What, in this whole project, in your whole involvement in the entire process,
Yeah.
what is your most satisfying experience? What made you the happiest about this?
Okay, the question is, what was the most satisfying thing, this project? The most satisfying thing was to try to do a large-scale restoration and have the partners and the funds to do it. Because when I worked for the state, we didn't. And that's where, you know, we'd do a prairie planting, and we would be lucky if we could put in 30 species. You saw we put in, seed-wise, 170 species. The state, we didn't have the money to do it. So that was a satisfying thing, doing a really large-scale restoration, having the funds to do it right, and having the partners to help you do it. That was most satisfying. You want the least satisfying? Yeah.
Well, my question was already asked and answered, but it's about, it's hit and miss in terms of seeing the buffalo.
Yeah.
But Midland does have a special meaning to me because I was, during the Vietnam War, I was stationed there before Midland was Midland. And then and my son went to the U of I and he said to write a paper up on Midland when it was Midland.
Okay.
And now my father-in-law was a World War II veteran, is buried there, so.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in the Plainfield area, which is near Joliet. And I remember during the Vietnam War, I knew people that worked out there, and they would come back and their hair was kind of orangish colored and stuff. I don't know what they were getting into out there. But I knew people that worked out there, but it was always a mystery. And the Army, it wasn't necessarily the Army. It was a contractor-run, Army-owned or government-owned. And it was difficult getting in. They made it really hard for us at first. They thought we were going to do something, I don't know what. But it took years to get the confidence that they would let us in there and do things. And then once they decided to close, they just gave us the key. Anything else? Yeah.
Did you find anything fun with all the digging for tiles? Like, Any archaeological ones?
Oh, okay, yeah, so the question is, no, the question is, did we find anything fun digging for the tiles? Didn't find any archaeological stuff, but anyway, the most fun thing I thought was that some of it was put in that Dolomite Prairie area, and they had to dig down into the Dolomite rock to put the tile in. So the soil was this deep, then they went down this far, it dug a trench in the Dolomite. I'm like, there's also a little stream, there's a stream out there where it runs over that Dolomite bedrock, and in order to drain things faster, they dug a channel. It's about a foot deep and about, 5 feet wide. They dug a channel down that stream bed to make it flow a little faster. And that was done, I don't think that was done by the Army. That was done by, the farmers that were farming the land.
Hey, Bill, what was the name of the lily that you were happy about? The
That was the Turk's cap lily.
Turk's cap?
Yeah. All right, anything else?
We have some Zoom questions.
All right.
Mary was asking, how accessible are these areas? Do we have to stay within certain spaces, or is the whole area open for wandering or hiking?
All right, so there are areas out there that are still closed to the public. When we did the prairie plan, one thing a few of us, myself included, were really adamant about, we do not want to restrict people from going out, walking in the prairie. This is going to be a reconstructed prairie. We want people to enjoy it. And we decided, we would say, make paths, and you tell people that there's ticks out there and stuff. That keeps most of them on the path. But we did not want to require people to stay on paths if they wanted to go out in the prairie to enjoy it. Most people aren't going to. But there are areas there's an area near the Iron Bridge trailhead. There's about 40 acres there you can go to, which is really close to the trailhead. You can get out and walk in. Some of these other areas, they're near trails, but you've got to walk a little ways. And some of the trails, you might have to walk a mile or so to get to. But I would say if you just want to go and see some prairie, the Iron Bridge trailhead, and I'm not sure what's going on here.
Bill, would a good start be go to the visitor center?
Well, I would go to the visitor center, but the Iron Bridge trailhead, I don't know what's going on. The Iron Bridge trailhead's a good spot to start because there's a prairie there we planted, and we put a lot of seed in just to make it look good. Other questions, Linnell?
We have one more Zoom question.
All right.
How many different species of birds are there in the area?
Oh, boy. Well, here's the problem with that question. I'm going to assume that they're talking breeding birds because there's all kinds of migrants that go through. And I don't quite remember, but it's around 100, I think. You have to remember that I showed you prairie areas. There's wooded areas. There's some savanna areas. There's the streams. There's more than just prairie out there. Prairie will be the largest, and so grassland birds, but there's shrublands out there. There's a whole slew of shrubland birds, like mockingbirds and blue grosbeaks and chats and stuff like that. Probably a little under 100, I'd guess.